Welcome everyone. My name is Jen Walinga and I'm a professor of communication and culture at Royal Roads University. And I want to welcome you to our webinar series on sport, leadership, and social change. This is episode 3 of the series on sport for human and social development, whole athletes, whole communities. We have a fantastic panel of experts who will engage in a robust discussion, and we welcome your questions throughout, of course. We've gathered a few prior to the webinar, so we'll be addressing some of those during the discussion. And I'll just speak for a few minutes before we get rolling. We always like to start at Royal Roads by acknowledging first and thanking the Lekwungen and Kosapsan people, also known as Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations communities, for allowing us to live and work and play on their lands. We also give thanks to the ancestors, the supernatural ones, creatures, big and small, hereditary leaders and matriarchs for looking after the rich resources and cultural teachings of this beautiful land. This path, I always like to highlight, is the path to through Mystic Vale, where I live in Cadbro Bay in Victoria, on the same lands, but love this path. I take the dogs through here often, and it's quite mystical, quite a beautiful recovery place for me. And ironically, this is the path I take to my office each morning when I'm working on campus. And I haven't been there for some time now, of course, but you'll recognize the similarities. So I think I'm drawn to similar kinds of environments. And this is Royal Roads. This is the campus in which I work and play and teach and learn. And I think this picture is so indicative of the environment we like to teach in and honor. Royal Roads leans heavily on the land, and we're surrounded by 100-year-old old growth forest. We also have a very checkered history, coal barons, estate, military college. So it's quite a mixture of historical learnings that we draw from, but we're always centered within nature and feel very fortunate to be so and learn from it constantly. A lot of the programs we offer at the university, they're all interdisciplinary, but a lot of them really reflect on systems thinking. And so we're constantly looking out the window of our offices and our classrooms at this beautiful landscape. We also look out over the lagoon, Esquimalt Lagoon, and the ocean, the Salish Sea, and across to the Olympic Mountains. We are lucky to walk through gardens that were, of course, developed by the Dunsmuirs, who built the castle on the lands as well. And we've inherited this beautiful rose garden right outside my office. The little house in the background is where I work. I have to literally smell the roses before I go to any meeting. The university is really designed to address and respond to the needs of mid-career professionals. So whether they're doing a BA or an MA or a grad cert or continuing studies, our model is all about community and caring and transformational change. So we try to foster experiences that really drive personal change in order for people to understand how to foster change in others and in their communities. So this webinar series seems perhaps to some a little out of place. These pictures, I don't think I've ever mentioned this, but these are my 3 kids, all playing different sports. It's been a very important tenet of our family. And I think sport belongs at Royal Roads because sport is all about leadership and social change. We're constantly developing the skills that enable us to foster positive change in the world as athletes, as coaches, as officials, as spectators, and everyone can participate in sport. You don't have to be an athlete to appreciate the learning sport has to offer. Sport for Society is a course that we recently developed and offered in the summer. We had 40 registrants our first time through. And I think, again, it really honors the interdisciplinary nature of the programs and schools at our university. We talked about sport for development, sport for diversity and inclusion, education, the environment, equity and human rights, health, media and communication, and peace. And these topics all reflect the schools at our university as well. School of Humanitarian Studies, we have a School of Education and Technology, and on and on. So I really feel that sport is a wonderful cross-disciplinary topic that can embrace all of these concepts and really discuss all of them within a certain realm. And I think, you know, I'm an athlete and have a sport background and I'm very involved in sport, but I really think it has a unique role to play. And that's why this webinar series was created. In my school, we talk a lot about communication and culture and how important the idea of minding and bridging the gaps is and how fundamental that is to any kind of social change efforts. So the bridge is our symbol. And to build a bridge, you really need to understand the gap. You have to understand the differences between you and the other, whether it's trying to reach your hand out for a handshake or actually build a physical bridge or connect in some other way. It starts with minding the differences. We also have a partnership with Game Plan, which is a program organization that supports athletes as they transition out of sport and into a career or into the community. And of course, that starts early on in their career as athletes. And education is crucial. Reflecting on the learnings that they're gaining from sport is crucial in preparing them to really leverage their sport experience, their sport degree, as I like to call it. And you know, if you're an Olympian, you do have that OLY after your name now, right? So it is being acknowledged as a degree. At Royal Roads, we also acknowledge the learnings that you gain through your sport experience, and we count that for credit. So through our flexible admission policy, we can actually welcome athletes in and acknowledge the learnings they've already gained through their international experience, training, competing, traveling, and interacting with other cultures. So this is Andrea Burke. She's actually doing some research with me right now and played for Canada for the rugby team. And one of her testimonies is really to acknowledge that the learning that she gained through sport, she could then apply through her formal academic training and then bring back to sport. She studied the rugby team as part of her thesis and continues to work in that realm now. And someone posted a question before the webinar asking about this rumor that we may be creating an MA in sport leadership. We are gradually working toward that and developing one course at a time. So we'll start with a grad cert. We also have an undergraduate certificate in development right now that is geared toward athletes who are competing now, training now, but still keen to be gaining educational credit. And so they can be doing that. Of course, at Royal Roads, we've been doing online learning for 25 years. I know it's kind of new for everybody and everybody's doing it now, but we've been doing it for a long time. And that makes it much more possible for athletes to be training and also pursuing their studies. So this is our third episode, Sport for Human and Social Development, Whole Athletes, Whole Communities. And we have a fantastic group of panelists, Matt Young, Heather Mcmanus, Adrienne Leslie-Toogood, Tom Hall, and Krista Van Slingerland. I'll start by introducing them. One second, please. And then we'll dive into a good discussion. So Heather Mcmanus is manager of sport Freestyle Ontario, and following a 15-year career as an athlete on the Canadian trampoline team, she earned international podium performances in individual and synchronized trampoline, reaching finals at the Olympic Games in Athens 2004. Heather's objective has been to be a system builder in Canadian sport with the goal of inspiring human excellence and lifelong wellness through values-based and participant-centered sport programming. Heather's a qualified teacher as well as a coach, master coach developer for both gymnastics and freestyle skiing, and she's supported numerous sport organizations with quality sport and coaching initiatives through Sports Minded Consulting Limited. As a long-term development advisor with Sport for Life, she's been fostering change across the sport system. She's now in a new manager of sport role, and she's responsible for high performance sport development and coaching programs at Freestyle Ontario. Dr. Adrienne Leslie-Toogood is a former All-Canadian basketball player, now a licensed psychologist and adjunct faculty at the University of Manitoba. She has extensive experience working with athletes in Canada and the United States at all levels of performance, and currently Director of Mental Performance at the Canadian Sports Centre Manitoba. Faculty member at the University of Manitoba as well, and within her consulting and professional practice, she focuses on empowering people to manage their humanity so they're able to maximize their human potential. Love that. She works hard to ensure people are able to fully enjoy their entire life experience, the highs and lows, that they're continually learning and growing both as a person and performer. Krista Van Slingerland is a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa, researching mental health and mental illness in competitive and high performance athletes. Krista became interested in this area of study following her own struggles with mental illness as a university athlete. She's an all-Canadian basketball player, and this experience illuminated harsh realities about the sports system and culture that can actually deter help-seeking, diminish the importance of mental health. Krista co-founded the Student Athlete Mental Health Initiative in 2013, a charity devoted to promoting and protecting the mental health of Canada's university athletes. A conference all-star for the University of Ottawa GGs, Krista is now working with Dr. Natalie Duran-Bush to design, implement, and evaluate a Canadian Centre for Mental Health in Sport. This will feature specialized interdisciplinary mental health services for competitive and high-performance athletes and coaches. Matt Young is a passionate health, recreation, and sports servant leader who believes that supporting quality athletic achievement is good for our children, our communities, and our society. He's a world record holder for the Cross National Bike Relay, and Matt raised over $1 million for juvenile diabetes through this experience. Matt has 25 years of experience in the allied healthcare sector, where he was recognized as one of British Columbia and Canada's top 40 under 40 business leaders. He has 15 years experience in coaching at grassroots level, and he's an active entrepreneur, founder of Personal Sport Record, Innovative Fitness, 60-Minute Kids Club, and now the Quality Sport Hub. He's raised over $6 million in total for charity, and Matt now consults with sport organizations locally, nationally, internationally on physical literacy and long-term athlete development resources, tools, and supports. And finally, Tom Hall has a diverse background in marketing and communications and has worked for many of Canada's largest and most respected publications as a writer and editor. I got to get you on faculty here at Royal Roads there, Tom. We'll talk after. As a respected leader in the Canadian sports system, he's worked for over a decade to make the national team athlete journey safe, fair, and healthy as possible. Former executive director of Athletes Can, he helped develop athlete leaders and advocated for athlete funding and athlete rights. And now as national manager of Game Plan, Canada's Total Athlete Wellness Program, he is proud to be supporting a team of Game Plan advisors as they help Canada's athletes develop, not just as high-performing athletes, but also as well-rounded individuals. As a multi-medalist sprint canoe athlete, he's proud to be giving back to his sport as Vice President of Canoe Kayak Canada. And I also want to thank our team from Royal Roads. We have Andrea and Amara and Karen, who support us through a lot of webinars. Of course, webinars are just taking off and going crazy, right? So we end up leading a lot of these and delivering so many. And this team is just really quite the mod squad in the background. They'll be monitoring chat for questions eventually as well. But thanks to them, we also tracked a number of questions beforehand, and so we'll be able to address some of those through the discussion. Thank you all for showing up, for joining us on this webinar, and I promise you will have an exciting conversation. And so let's dive in. Awesome. I've got my little cheat sheet here. You know, the first thing, of course, that you'll notice as I introduced the panel was that they all have athletic backgrounds. Which is always quite exciting for me because I think, yeah, it really does work. You know, when people are busy with sport all their life, they really end up kind of coming back and giving back in some way. These individuals have given back in a big way. I just want to start by laying a bit of a foundation in getting you all to think about sport, the role it's played in your life, why you've chosen to remain involved and to give back in different ways. What has made you so committed to sport? And if I can, let's maybe begin with Tom. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jen. And hello, everyone. What has made me so committed to sport? I think, well, I've been involved in sport since I was a very little kid. I had a fairly severe learning disability. I guess I still do. So I had a ton of trouble reading. I acted out in school, and sport was my place. You know, a phys ed teacher made a sport environment that was safe and welcoming for all kids of varying athletic abilities. And my parents, I think, knew that I just had to move and I had to be active, and that's what I did. And so in a way, it was my refuge. It was a place that gave me confidence and allowed me to thrive. And when I look back now 30 years 30 years later, it's been one of the main constants, if not the constant, in my life, other than family. And I've benefited enormously from sport and the organized sport system in Canada. And so for me, why I'm involved in sport, why I work in sport, and why I volunteer in sport is because there are ways it can be better, without a doubt. And like anything you love, I think you have to be a critic as much as a champion of it. So I'm here to put my money where my mouth is and try to make a bit of a difference.
So much. Adrian.
Always a journey to find the mute button. All right. It'll be interesting to hear people's story, but I think similar to Tom, sport always played a very valuable role in my life. And I think for me, and thinking about why I love sport, I think sport was a place where I could control a lot, and my efforts resulted, if I worked harder, I saw the benefits of that. I found a community in sport that was very valuable to me. I didn't have a lot of stability in my home. And interestingly, when I think about kind of safe sport, I'm very passionate about areas like safe sport. And when I reflect on why, I think I was someone who really needed sport, and it played a huge role in my life. And as a result, I'm very passionate about having safe spaces for other people who can use sport in that way. It was interesting. I had to think a little bit about sport because in my past life, I was actually an academic. I worked at Kansas State University for a number of years, and I had an opportunity to return to Canada and work in the sports system. And I spent some time reflecting on whether I did want to do that because I really loved my position. I loved my students. I loved giving back. And for me, at the end of the day, my decision was around partnering with people and helping them to be the best versions of themselves, especially under difficult circumstances. And I think the sport journey can be really taxing and demanding at times. And that's when we find the true kind of beauty within ourselves. And I think that if I can partner with people and have them the courage to lean into those moments and be the best version of them, I think we end up with some pretty incredible people that can be role models and contributors to, and, sort of local heroes in our own lives. So for me, I'm really passionate about the journey of sport. The last piece I'll say about that is there was someone who came to Winnipeg to give a talk, and she was the head of exploring at the Canadian Geographic, so she went into caves and places no one's been. And with my athletes, I often use metaphor and story, and I spoke to them about, I think that's why people love hearing about the story of sport, because for the sport journey, it's this inward journey, and you learn about yourself and you challenge yourself in ways, and you learn and grow, and we share that with other people. And so I think that I love encouraging people to be explorers and what it takes for me to get this done and to keep going and to get up. And I just really believe in the value of sport in its capacity to do that for us. So a bit of a longer answer than I was anticipating when I first unmuted myself, but there you go.
Awesome. So great. And thank you. I think we're seeing a thread here of what sport offered you, but then now what you can then offer others and the value that it provides. Yeah, I think it definitely saved me as well. Lovely to hear you articulate that so well. How about Krista?
Hey guys, yeah, similar sentiments to Tom and Adrian. I really believe in sport as a vehicle for people to develop positively, for kids to make positive connections with their peers. And it really was that for me growing up. And then I had a really difficult experience in university, a very abusive sport environment. I really struggled with my mental health, and I saw that, yes, sport can be this wonderful vehicle, but there was a huge barrier then. From sport being that positive force for everyone. And I felt really determined to contribute to, helping the sport community get past that barrier and have those conversations about mental health and mental illness. And because I really do believe that sport can be fantastic for everyone if, we have that cultural shift that we're all sort of trying to facilitate in our various ways. So it just wasn't my time to leave sport just yet. And I think I'm hooked now. So.
Absolutely. Totally identified, done a full circle as well. And I wonder sometimes we leave for a while to clarify our identity as separate from sport and then find your way back again, because it's sure great and fun. Thank you. And Matt.
Yes, thanks, Jennifer. I'll continue the thread of sport being a conduit for self-actualization for myself as well. In my younger years, came from a dysfunctional family in a pretty small town, so it was very tough. But sport provided me, which it provides many people, the tools for competence, confidence, character, and connection in the development of those very critical kind of staples of life. So that on the micro level, it's all about, harnessing the power of that and using it for moving yourself forward, like you've heard from everybody else. On a macro level, I think sport is really important for communities because sport is designed to bring people and communities together, like-minded people, new sports, different things. And I think what we've all noticed is a little bit of a pulling apart of the communities. And so I think it's very important to get back to that. It's been said around the culture of togetherness. Sports a dress rehearsal for real life. It's going to teach you everything that you need to know, especially at the younger levels. And you have a supportive environment if you fall down. So I think it's a really critical fabric of our human development.
Thank you. I just want to pause for a second and share something, because I want to encourage everybody to look up these wonderful people on various social media channels and follow them. But this is what Matt's referencing, this model of the C's. I like C's too, being from communication and culture. I tend to always sort of gravitate to the C words for some reason, but I think it's because they are these kinds of words, right? Connection, culture, culture, competence, confidence. So that holism of athlete development, there are lots of great models out there, but I thought I'd highlight that one. And also highlight that, you can follow these people in other ways and follow their research, their work, find them on social media, and I highly encourage you to do so. They're all wonderful human beings that are worth getting to know, even from afar. And Heather, let's finish with you. Why do you commit to sport?
Well, I think sport just made me happy as a child. It was the thing, place I felt comfortable, the place, I was shy as a kid. So being out there doing sport was a place where I felt comfortable. I didn't have to necessarily talk to people. So contrary to a lot of the typical women in sport research, it was like, for me, it was better that I could just do my sport. So I was a little different that way, maybe. And just that having a challenge, a common goal, being part of something. And that was sort of my initial sport experience. And I did, when I think of the things that had the biggest impact on me, there was sort of all extremes. I had, sort of non-competitive sport in outdoor ed. I had cross-country running in high school that was very much a social kind of sport that was character building. I had gymnastics, which for me in my situation was a very negative sport experience. And then I moved on to trampoline, which probably embodies what I still try to create for every athlete that I'm involved with, which is a very positive sport experience and very empowering and uplifting. So and that was at the high performance level. So one of the things that I always sort of argue is that it's not high performance or fun, or high performance or excellence or human development. It really, really can be both, because I think the highest level sport experience I had was the most positive as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Heather. You mentioned that sport can be a place where you can be quiet, and be a little more introverted. And we just had a big crew, I rode back in the 90s, and we get together often, and we had a big loss recently. So we gathered and we were sharing that insight in particular, that it was a safe place to be ourselves. And whether that was the extroverted Marnie McBean or the more introverted Kathleen Heddle, we all belonged and we could all be completely ourselves. So thank you for highlighting that aspect of it. And building on that, the next question I'd like to throw out there to everybody, and let's just be a little more loose now so that I'm not having to intervene or moderate so much. If you'd like to poke in, maybe just give me a wave and I can acknowledge or unmute and dive in and make your comments. I think it would be nice to just make it a little more of a dialogue and conversation. So what is working in sport? People were asking that before the webinar, you know, how do I make sure that I am keeping it fun and about being our best, being everything that you can be, or unlocking potential? What is working? Where is it working? You mentioned trampoline, Heather, but what about trampoline really makes that culture a healthy, happy, productive kind of culture in sport? And please inviting everybody to weigh in on that as you see fit.
I guess I'll jump in since you specifically asked about trampoline, but I think the amazing thing about that sort of like even in that high performance environment, was athletes were really pursuing their own, you know, dreams. It wasn't about the result, although results were part of it, but it was about what more could you. It was really about excellence. It was about excellence in so many aspects of being a human being. And when sometimes your goals for maybe school or maybe other things interfered, that was supported just as much as that high performance, you know, sport outcome. So yeah, just being surrounded by those like-minded people, sort of steering your own ship or whatever, you know, just taking, you know, leading your own journey, I think was a big aspect of that, being respected as a human being, for sure.
And I think I'll jump into that as well. I think you touched on a lot of things that are very important there. And I think that it's really important in sport that we value the human being and help them to be the best version of themselves. And that's you know, physically, but it's also emotionally and mentally as well. And I know we have Bell Let's Talk Day coming up later in the month, and Krista alluded to sometimes in the sport environment, we don't necessarily do a great job of noticing that, but there's also a lot of coaches that are phenomenal in that. And I'm thinking in particular of one of my coaches that's working with a Tokyo Olympian right now. And he would admit that he's had to grow a lot of it as a coach as well, because he had an athlete who was an unbelievable talent and also a very emotional young woman. And he had a lot of difficulty at first misinterpreting that in terms of her drive and her focus and her desire to be there. And yet she was an incredibly driven person, but this was part of who she was. And I think they had to learn to work with that. And it was interesting, just prior to the shutdown, my last time being with this coach and this athlete in the training environment, he had come over to talk to me and he said, you know, I think I misinterpreted that. He goes, I think that's actually her superpower. And I said, yeah, I think it is. And I said, you should talk to her about that. And so he's grown a lot in that. And, you know, it's just, so I think in sports, sometimes there's so many great resources in this space right now, you know, looking at things like emotional agility with Susan David and being curious and compassionate. So it sounds like what Heather was saying was it was a very value aligned environment, an environment where athletes were able to pursue it because of what they're passionate about. And that's when we unleash the real power of sport, is when we have that alignment. And I don't think anyone doesn't want it. I think we're just not sure how to deal with it. And we like control in sport. And how do we deal with that? And so for me, we have to understand the way human beings are made, and we have to incorporate that into the training environment and embrace the humanity in the training environment. It's not something to be scared of, or it's not something that's wrong. It's something that's beautiful. And that's how we can do amazing things. Just like athletes show up with unique skills and only that person can do it, we also show up with unique life experiences, and we interpret and react and respond to the environment. We get into trouble when people hide that and don't feel comfortable showing that. And when we define that as being failure, sometimes because we're so ego invested, and it's such a threat to us when our athletes don't perform. So again, I think that there's a lot of that involved in those safe, brave spaces where we have the courage to see what it can become.
I think that's a great point, and I want to continue that emerging thinking, because there is a lot of emerging thinking that's happening. I mean, you've got the newcomers, and where before it might have been a token mention about a newcomer, now you've got people that are specifically working on that and sharing that information on how to the actioning. You've got things like diversity and inclusion that have gone from we should be talking about this to people leading that. So Adrian brings up a really good point about people's thinking changing, especially with this pandemic. I mean, the saying is never waste a good crisis. Lots of opportunities have come to share a lot of information, just like you're doing, Jen. And I think that's one of the things that's working really well. On the other side of the coin, what's working in sport is ego and FOMO. being primary drivers in the race to the bottom. And it is the elephant in the room. It's not positive. And I think we have to really think about how we're going to unpack that and how we're going to solve that problem of FOMO, fear of missing out, and ego as primary human motivators in sport. That is, are things that we need to address. And how are we going to address that so that we can get back to the good side and the positive side of sport?
I'll jump in. I think on I agree with everything that's been said. And I like the use of FOMO there. The ego, id, superego, FOMO. Is that the, that's pretty great. But I think in terms of what's good, there's so much that's good. And again, as someone who has been relatively, I don't want to say, I try to be constructive when I'm critical, but I'm not afraid to be critical if I think something isn't working right. And I say it knowing that there is so much good and not only potential good, but good that's happening, and we just don't hear those stories. One of the partners of Game Plan is Deloitte. They're one of our founding partners, and they're involved in the program. You know, when we talk with their senior leadership about the program, they're engaged in it because they think that athletes that come out the system, regardless of whether or not they've won a medal, are able to contribute a tremendous amount to society. Like they've learned things, they've challenged themselves, and that they're able to contribute. And I think that's a really nice, you know, that's a nice thing, and that's a positive thing from sport, or, you know, high level sport. But you know, and there are stories all over the place of excellent teachers, excellent coaches, just getting kids active and fostering that love of sport. And we can't forget that. I think in the write-up for this session, Jen highlighted some of the drops in participation, and those are huge concerns for me personally. I wanted to be a phys ed teacher for a while, and then I realized I wouldn't be a very good one. But those numbers are terrifying, and so, you know, how do we fix that? How do we align that with our other goals in high performance sport? Are the big questions. But you know, before we get into some of the problems and potential solutions, I do think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, 99% of the people I work with in sport are 100% committed to the right thing and trying to do the right thing. And they're under-resourced and they're struggling. Time is a constraint, money is a constraint, but these are people that would agree with everything we're saying and trying really hard. And I think they owe our, you know, our respect and acknowledgement of that.
My daughter and I counted up our coaches in our lifetimes. And we each came up with around 30, like 29 to 30, and really had only had one that had made us uncomfortable in some way, you know. So I love that 99%. So highlighting those. And before I get to Krista, I just want to kind of do a little summary here, like what's working, being open to diversity. It works when we appreciate that sport teaches us great things, you know, like Deloitte does, or, you know, Home Depot or somewhere, that we value sport as well as other things in people's lives, right? So that works. That helps kids to really appreciate and enjoy sport. Understanding humanity. When people understand that human beings are complex, that helps sport. It works when we separate the coach goals from the athlete goals and don't get them all tangled up. It works when we confront things like fear of missing out and ego, and we're brave in these spaces. And it really works when we acknowledge and share the really great stories that are out there, thousands of great stories that are out there. Cool. And Krista, do you want to finish off? Do you have something to add?
Yeah, sure. Adrian talked about a coach whose mind was changed. And I shared with you guys that I did have a really difficult experience with one university coach, but I also had an incredibly positive experience with another. And what made it so positive was his openness to learning and to thinking differently, and his acknowledgement of there being more to life than sport, and certainly so much more in life after sport. He had asked us at the beginning of my 5th year, I think, to write down our strengths and weaknesses on the basketball court. And one of the weaknesses I listed was my struggle with my mental health. And he put a stop to that right away. And he told me that, you know, my struggle with mental health is my greatest strength, and it gives me such an opportunity to teach my teammates about what I struggle with and how to respond. And that created this wonderful, safe space for me to excel as an athlete, but mostly just to heal from that previous experience and come out still loving sport. Because I think if I didn't have that experience, I wouldn't still be involved. So always a big shout out to Coach Sparks at the University of Ottawa for, honestly changing my life.
Love it. Thank you. Yeah, acknowledging these great influencers in our life.
Hey, Jen, I just wanted to jump into something Krista said, because it really sparked for me that I think that sport really provides us an opportunity to care deeply for other people, and to jump past the superficial stuff and to really jump into it and have real connection. And that's what struck me with Krista, was that, in our day-to-day lives, we could put up these blockades and not let people in, but in sport, you're in, because, just the type of conversation and relationship and what you need to do together. And so I think that's maybe what makes it so beautiful, but then what also makes people so vulnerable at the same time.
And you've all mentioned having something that really drew you to sport or kept you in sport or framed sport as a real positive in your life. And then it seemed that a negative experience kind of challenged you to protect sport or rescue it or address it or get involved, to keep it the way that you maybe initially experienced. I had the same experience. I feel like this warrior around sport now. So protective. What else is working? Let's talk a little bit more about what's working, because there's so much we can learn from those strengths.
Jennifer, I was going to say, sort of relating to something, Matt said about the ego and FOMO, but also when you, the idea of that coach and athlete goal not matching, and sometimes it's also a parent goal that's not matching. But that quite often all of those people are so passionate and so well-meaning, and that ego and FOMO is a really good way of looking at that. It's like well-meaning people that want the best for the person that they're fighting for, or whatever might be going on, and it's really more about missing the point than it is about anything really truly negative, right? Like it's turning striving into something negative, be it this lone clawing people back instead of striving together to be better. And so, yeah, I wanted to kind of highlight that, because I think, and the difference is what Krista mentioned, is that open mind of being able to turn your sort of your best intentions into something that actually sort of manifests in a better way as well.
And that might start with someone reaching out and asking, what are your good reasons? What's behind this behavior that may be interpreted by some as quite negative, but it's well-meaning and there's some positive intention behind it. Trying to understand that with links back to Adrian's understanding of humanity. Love it. Any other things to add on that?
Yeah, I would just add, I think, in general, sport has acknowledged the need to treat, again, high performance sport has acknowledged the need to treat athletes better. And to recognize them as whole people. And I think, you can, as we were saying before this panel started, that people perform better if they've got some balance in their lives. And this is a well-researched topic, right? And balance is maybe not the right word, because the year before Olympics, you're probably not taking 5 courses at school, right? It's not a 50-50 balance, but it ebbs and flows over your career as an athlete. But it's important to have something else out there. And it's also important that you're fulfilled and that there are other things going on. And I think, the system game plan exists because of leaders in the sports system agreeing from really 11 separate organizations, if you want to go broad, that have some different motivations, but they all come together on this program to support athletes because they think it's the right thing to do. And leading this team has been an absolute privilege, because it's literally that conversation. It almost always comes down to, is this the right thing to do for the athletes? And it's, so for me, having been an athlete and having worked on athlete rights and all that stuff, it's incredibly powerful. But the other side of the coin, so from that's the leadership, but I think Krista might be better positioned to speak about this through her work with the Canadian Centre for Mental Health and Sport. But people are increasingly looking for that education around how to create safe and healthy environments and things like that. And it's wonderful. I mean, this is all going in the right direction, and I think it is really positive.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just going to hop in there because you're right. Change. We know that change happens through design or disaster, and either way is both positive because it forces us to think differently. And it's such a good point that from some of the things that we experience in sports, people saying, you know what, not right. That's not cool. We can do better, and that's the disaster side. But more importantly is the design side, and people saying, okay, let's not just react to what's happened. Let's actually get proactive around how can we come together and create the best environment for our athletes, whether it's high performance or even the entry level, the grassroots athletes. So I think that's one of the things when we think about change. It's a really good point that Tom's brought up, and that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you. And I just want to say this is working really well. Our flow is nice. You just unmute. I know that's you next. So go for it, Adrian.
I was just going to say that I really like what they were saying. And I think that balance is difficult. And I use the word blend because I think everyone has a different blend that works for them. And I think that if you couple that with kind of what Matt had just said around disaster versus, planning, being strategic, I think that again, in a high performance environment, we recognize, as Tom said, there's tons of literature saying you need balance or you need blend in your life. You need other identities, other purposes, other things. And so that's where as a sports system, we can step in and work to purposely engage that, considering the human in front of us, not only with our athletes, but our coaches and others as well. Because if you have that coach that had no balance or blend going into an Olympic Games, they're not going to be in a position where they can do their best coaching probably. So it's really tricky and difficult and precarious, and that's interesting. And I guess the other thing I'd link it to is the theory of passion with Valorant, where he talks about obsessive versus harmonious passion. And a lot of people in sport are very passionate people and they love what they do. And it's a matter of managing that delicately and being aware of that with themselves so it doesn't become that obsessive kind of rigid place, because then none of us are well, none of us are our best coach or our best athlete, etc. Too much of identity can't be on there. And the last part I'd say is looking at what's happening in our sports system, where that dedication is becoming younger and younger. And I always say, like, my main identity growing up was as an athlete, but when I look at the load I did, I do nothing compared to the kids nowadays. I was sort of like a 1 practice a day kind of girl, and I thought I was like in. And now I look at these kids from a very young age and they're going to academies and this and that. And if you look at sort of that identity versus role confusion in adolescence, by that time a lot of them are very committed athletes. So I think it's interesting to take some of these concepts and just consider, how do we develop and keep people healthy and well in the system to kind of protect them from themselves. And parents were mentioned and their parents. So I think there's some interesting elements right now that are important for sport leaders to pay attention to, so we can make sure to protect this environment and culture and these humans coming out at the end of the day.
You're leading into what's not working so well quite nicely here, this idea that maybe too obsessive, or what's leading us to get so fixated or imbalanced in our aspiration for excellence. How do we do that more sustainably? So just to wrap up this idea around what's working, and we'll come back, we'll just keep looping back to what is working: balance, understanding the differences between when something tips over into obsession, making it more sustainable, right, for coach, for athletes, so that balance really links into a sustainable approach to sport. And but we're tipping into that area of what isn't working. Matt mentioned the fear of missing out can cause us to behave in a problematic way, or ego can get in the way of true goals or what we should be focusing on, what's more sustainable for everybody. And this idea of becoming almost too obsessive so that we're out of balance. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What do you think's not working? What do you see as the barriers, the key challenges, the things we really need to but continue to hone in on and tackle and try to improve? It's a big question.
I might say just getting away from this idea that the means justifies the ends. It doesn't. At least I don't believe it does. It's not that important. I've never won an Olympic medal, so maybe someone like Tom can speak to that. But you're devaluing sport when we're perpetrating that idea. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Someone doesn't need to cry to win, right? They don't need to be pushed beyond a place. We had a a winning basketball coach who's now coaching in the NBA talked to our staff at the Olympic Committee early on in COVID. And it was a fascinating talk, but I just asked him, I was like, so how do you push athletes, beyond where they're supposed to go, kind of thing, which is something that, I don't believe a coach is supposed to do. So I was really curious to hear what he said, this guy who wins all the time and he's dealing with some of the best athletes in the world. And he's like, you push them to where they're ready to go. And if they're there and they're not ready, then you've made a mistake. And it was really an interesting take on that whole piece. And the end does not justify the means. I think hopefully sport is recognizing that these are people that are as complex as everyone else. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to say here, but I can't stress that enough. I still hear it. That's one of the things I still hear that really frustrates me is, you got to push them beyond where they think they can go, or, sometimes that's what it takes. And that's just never the answer. I just don't think it's ever worth it.
Yep, totally agree. And the saying is, you coach the way you're coached. And I'll take it out of the high performance level down to the regular level. And the reason that doesn't work in 2021 is because parents don't parent the way they were parented, and teachers can't you teach the way they were taught, because there's no more meter stick coming across the front of your desk or any of that stuff. So it is what it is. And I think that's one of the things that's not working is taking a 1995, a 1997, and a 2000 approach in 2021, or bemoaning the fact that kids are different. That's not going to work either. The saying is, and I know it's so cliche, you got to meet people where they are, but really you do. And Thomas just pointed that out. And otherwise, our options are to try to keep doing what we've done that's not working, or educate ourselves and level up to what this new generation needs, to what works in this new changing society. And again, everyone wants change. Nobody wants to change. So it's that constant friction between all of those things in and around change that I think are not working yet the way that they need to be in order to achieve the results that we all want to achieve from an athlete perspective, a parent perspective, a coach perspective, all stakeholders. Nobody sets out, as Heather has said, as Krista has said, and Adrian said, nobody sets out to, be that person. It's what we call as a misappropriation of love, is the best way to call it, and or is one way to call it. And I just think that that's not working. So what's not working is doing the same things we've always done and expecting the different results. And that's right from the leadership level right on down. So it starts with the leaders of the sport organizations, which is also not working because there is no leadership in the sport organization, because there is no minister of sport in Canada or the United States in an 8.7 and $19 billion business operating with no CEO and no operating system. We're reaping what we've sown. So I could go on forever about that, but I'll let someone else have a chance. In my humble opinion, in continuing Thomas's views and assertions there, that's not working.
Thank you. And I'm tracking these topics. The gap in leadership has come up in multiple environments I participated in. This ends justifying the means. Talk a little bit more about that. I just want to unpack it a little bit more. I can see Heather chomping at the bit here, wanting to get in. Yeah.
So I think that concept of coaching the way you were coached, or that's definitely leads to problems and leads to maybe negative styles of coaching that are outdated. But I always turn things around to the positive. That's just my way, I think. But I have to say that I think of there are 4 coaches that I have met along the way in different areas, and I hadn't realized it when I first met them or knew them, but each of them are very, very strong female coaches that in different sports. And sort of, it turns out, I found out over a couple of years, all 4 of us, and I sort of felt like I had a lot in common with them in terms of athlete-centered coaching and just really caring about the human rather than the athlete, and it turns out that all 4 of us experienced the same negative gymnastics program, and all 4 of us decided to be the complete opposite of that coach, of that approach. And so in a way, we all, each independently, not knowing that the others had been through that, had kind of come a similar journey to being absolutely not what you'd experienced that was negative, and trying to make sure other people never had that experience if we had anything to say about it. And I think that, like, going back to that sort of gymnastics experience, and I'd have to say that gymnastics from a systemic point of view in Canada is working really hard to make change. And there's, I just on a webinar a couple of days ago that was amazing. And I think, so there's some positive there too, but the thing that still exists, where there are people coaching the way they were coached, is this idea of breaking down athletes to build them back up, and thinking erroneously that you can build them stronger if you've broken them completely. But I don't know if I've ever heard of anyone who's actually stronger because, like, someone has purposely broken them down. And I remember reading an article where it was sort of justifying a coach that had been sort of criticized by a high level athlete, and saying, well, yeah, he's a tough coach, but he dealing with this coach teaches you to be mentally tough. And I just remember thinking, okay, this was saying it was a good thing in the article. In my gut, I was like, you shouldn't have to be mentally tough to deal with a coach. Your coach should be helping you to be mentally tough, should be making, it should be adding to your strength, not adding on the side of your challenges, right? So anyway, that's what I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, thank you. I've chatted with a buddy who does a lot of research in this, and many of you have mentioned there's so much evidence to show that actually people do perform better when they are healthy, whole, happy, balanced, etc. So there is evidence. That's not necessarily doing the trick though, because the discourse is still raging. This myth of machismo, the myth of the breaking down the tough coach, almost like a disappointment if I didn't get hurt. I'm not really an athlete if I didn't get kind of harassed along the way somehow. How do we deal with that? Because we all agree, that that's not really what we want. It's probably not going to be good for anybody in the long run. But there's a strong discourse out there still. What do we do about that? Adrian, you've got your mute off.
Yeah. First of all, I'm just saying that I really like these panelists, Jen. They're really cool people. I'd like to hang out with them a lot more. And then, and there's so much I want to say. First, like Matt, with the leadership, I think that I often think sport's a microcosm for society. And I think with the whole COVID global pandemic, we're learning that we have leaders that are struggling, and like, it's so difficult to be a leader. What is a leader? And you think of all the leadership development training you do. There's so many people that have leadership positions that haven't done that training in sport and outside of sport. So I couldn't, I think that's so great. For me, I often try and use physical metaphors and examples. And I think if you think of the sport journey, and we're trying to get people to sink into training and become stronger and fitter, if energy is going towards managing your response to a coach, you don't have as much available to next day to do the training load, And so I want all my athletes to spend all their energy breaking down their cells and becoming even stronger and better and fitter. I don't want them dealing with that stuff with their coach, And then if you go totally deep dive the other way and you start talking about real crazy stuff, you can look at the literature on self-compassion theory, which is like the opposite. And it's really about being kind to yourself. And what's really interesting is when you look at the literature, I had a student who looked at failure experiences, and people who were more self-compassionate had better heart rate variability after that, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, now we're talking about recovering physiologically, and if you're walking around and you don't have good heart rate variability moment to moment, you're not recovering, you're not sleeping as well, etc. So you can continue to beat yourself in the ground, but you might be good because you're talented, but you're not going to be great and your best, And so for me, it's again, looking at how do humans work? We're able to put you in a functional MRI much more readily now. We can look at the way stuff's affecting you, and we can look at the connection to performance. And I think that we have to talk about it from that lens to start to get people to buy in, because there's too much myths out there. There's too much kind of correlation doesn't mean causation. You've had the worst performance at your life. In regression towards the mean, you're always going to get better. Coach berates you, you get better. They attribute causation to the fact that a coach just yelled at you. And it's just because you're better than that. You had a bad day. It's not the coach yelling at you that made you better. So again, there's just so much that we could throw in there. And I think that people have touched on so many really important topics, and it's always top down. I think leadership is so, so important.
Thank you, Krista.
Yeah, I want to jump in there. I think it's two things, and playing off what Adrian said. One is to stop allowing successful coaches to use a means to an end that is not ethical and celebrating their successes. We got to start calling people out, and it's not pretty, and it's not going to be a comfortable conversation. But I think too often, especially abusive behaviors, are hidden by medals and success, and people don't want to call out those coaches because their jobs depend on a winning record. You know, it's a tough thing to do. And then the other thing is, and what I realized really early when I started to coach, was this idea that Matt talked about, that you coach the way you were coached. And so my athletes would make a mistake, and the reaction running through my head was totally inappropriate and not the way that I wanted to coach. So I needed to take a second to figure out, okay, well, how can I actually do this? And I don't think that we're teaching coaches another way of coaching. And so there needs to be education there to help coaches address their athletes and help them develop in a positive way, using tactics that aren't, abusive, that aren't breaking them down to build them back up, which I've heard a lot. And the last thing I'll say is this idea that adversity automatically creates mental toughness. I've also heard a lot. And I always challenge that with, you don't throw a non-swimmer into the ocean and expect that to teach them how to swim, right? You teach them and gradually, put them in deeper water. And so in the same way, putting athletes in adverse and harsh environments without adequately supporting them and teaching them how to build the mental skills to deal with that adversity does not equal mental toughness. It's, you're hurting people. So we need to balance that challenge with that support as well.
Love it. Tom?
Yeah, I think to build off what everyone's saying, Matt really nailed a piece too. And I think, like, what are we trying to do? Like, if participation's dropped X number over past 30 years and our investment in sport has gone up over that time, our dollar investment in sport as a country has gone up over that time, what's, okay, clearly something's wrong. I would say clearly something's wrong, and we're missing something, right? And whether it comes from the top or it comes from the bottom, I find it fascinating that we don't have a coherent strategy to deal with that, because regardless of whether or not your concern is winning Olympic medals or just getting people moving because it's healthy and it's going to be cheaper in the long run to have healthy people, from a societal standpoint, we're not addressing that problem. And so I always come back to, like, what is the value of sport? What is it that an Olympic and Paralympic sport specifically, that's my world. So what is the value? What are we giving back to Canada? Is it inspiration? There's some evidence for that, but if participation rates are declining, then there's something missing, right? So there's got to be more there, and we need to ask that question. 20 years ago, to land in Olympics, I think the focus was really on medals and this, important but only symbolically important goal of winning the first gold medal on Canadian soil, which, was going to happen. But, we did wonderfully well, and that did change the sports system. Now we have to ask ourselves, 10 years on, what do we need to do now to change the sports system? But more importantly, what did we miss last time around, and how do we make it relevant for the next 30 years? Now, there's just one more piece on this, because it's something I thought about a lot when COVID started. I don't live in the most affluent part of Ottawa. There's public housing are my neighbors. And I always think, okay, I had this wonderful experience through my sport of canoe kayak. I grew up in a middle-class suburb in Montreal, and what is sport doing for the kids behind me that I see over the fence and that I talk to, and how through COVID can we help these people? And my dream, and it's impossible for an NSO to do this, so I'm not placing blame on anyone on this, but my dream would have been, you bring a bus up, you grab those kids, bring them to a river, teach them, safe water sports and swimming, and that is just part of the investment that happens. And it's difficult through COVID and masks and contact. I understand all that, but there's got to be something, because I see these kids playing in the park anyway. And what can we do to affect their lives in a positive way? And I just, there are missed opportunities, but again, I'm not placing blame because it requires capacity, both people, dollars, and all the rest. It's just, yeah, there's so much potential there.
And Andrea Carey just weighed in here. Tom, you might know her too. An important vision, what sport contributing to society? We're missing the kids that need sport the most. What's getting in the way of that? Just park that for a minute. Matt has some comments first.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that was my original answer when the question was, is the bifurcation of experiences. It's the pay to play, and if you have, you're good, and if you don't have, you're left out. And that's not going to get better after a pandemic, without focus and without some real effort and real leadership, which goes back to leadership. But I want to go on something that Krista said about coaching, and I think that coach education is one of the things that definitely needs to be revisited. Number one, it shouldn't be centralized. There's no way that coach education should be centralized when we've got education institutions right across our country that could be doing an exemplary job of that and creating that feeder system and ecosystem within their cities, communities, provinces, etc. And this is not to disparage coach education, because in both the United States and Canada, it is centralized and it doesn't work. It's ineffective. Number two, but before we even get to that, if you want to babysit, you got to take a course. You can't just show up and babysit a kid, and that's for 7, 8, and 9-year-olds. And there's a pretty strict process that you have to check off to babysit. Why we keep giving passes to volunteer coaches, and I'm talking about the grassroots and amateur level. Well, they're just volunteers. Well, you know what? There's a lot of great volunteer programs that require people to do a lot. You set the bar low, and of course, everyone's just going to raise their foot high enough just to clear it. But I think coach education is one of those things, given the importance of all of this, given the importance of leadership, the importance of mentors, that needs to be revisited in North America and reprioritized. First of all, it needs to move away from the technical, tactical X's and O's. And Jean Cote has done a really good job of that in transformational coaching. That conversation has become front and center. It needs to get into activating what we've studied through the Canadian Athlete Development Matrix and the United States Quality Coach Framework. And it needs to get into how do we actually nurture, bring out confidence, character. How's that showing up? And as a volunteer coach, what can we do at the grassroots level? We don't have to have our PhDs, but what can we do to make sport fun? What can we do to connect with the kids first and then do all those other things? Because we all know on this panel, if you do that first, you're going to have a good outcome anyway. But we always, ends justify the means. We always look to the end first and the win and the victory at the expense of all of that stuff, when really we've got a little bit backwards. So I just wanted to expand on what Krista said and weigh in on the coach education as a really important opportunity. On one hand, it's got to be more than the Nike and USOC's 5-minute video on how to coach kids. On the other hand, it doesn't need to be a laborious 4-day fly there, take the course, stay at the hotel, and you get your ABC license for grassroots. So we've got to find some sort of happy medium in the middle. And in my opinion, that should be what's happening in physical education. Because if we're talking about leadership and sports leadership, it's not really different than being a good manager, a good teammate, a good employee, a good husband, a good wife, a good anything. So why we're not teaching quality leadership in general courses in high school and university, I think is another opportunity. But I'll stop there and let somebody else weigh in.
And we have a whole school of leadership in our university, and it was one of our flagship programs. And I think it is infiltrating a lot in a lot of different realms of society for sure. But you make such a good point about there's also in leadership, there's this idea of just build trust. We're talking in abstracts quite a bit today, but also in some real tactical, practical ways, which I'm loving, and I think our audience is loving as well, and seeking and craving. But we tend to do that, talk in abstracts in the leadership literature as well, and in coaching. Just do this, just respect the humanity. Well, how? Well, we've already had a few great examples shared from the panelists of listening, being open to change, having an actual channel of feedback, acknowledging what it is that athletes are learning through sport and talking about that, right? Making that more explicit instead of just kind of letting it happen naturally, being intentional about developing leadership skills. I love this. Nancy Mollenhauer I used to teach with, and she's an amazing field hockey player, but coach as well. And she would trace, a kid would score, and she would trace that goal back to the very first pass, on the field loudly so everybody could hear. She would trace it back so that they all understood they were contributing. She was communicating so much with just that one act, right? But as Matt says, coaches need these tools and strategies, or they're just going to revert back or feel a little bit at a loss. You've mentioned leadership lots, so let's go there now. What are we looking for in terms of leadership of education, coach education, parental education, education right across, but also leadership more generally across the sports system? What are some of the gaps? What's getting in the way? If you think about physical education, there's not a lot of, there's reduced resources around arts and physical education. How do we reinvigorate that motivation?
A couple thoughts came to me when you were speaking, and I think when Matt was speaking too. And one of them is the concept of sort of reflective practice for coaches, and it comes up in the literature a lot in coach learning, and certainly our coaching courses try to use this. But I feel like there's a lot of sort of going through the motions when it comes to reflective practice, and to the point where coaches don't even know what you mean when you say it, almost, right? Like, reflect on this, and it's like, oh, reflect again, really? But actually digging in and questioning yourself, like really looking at something that's hard to examine about yourself as a coach or a leader, and actually, or even if you don't think you have to question, just look at it from another point of view. How could you do something differently that's different than you currently do it, that would also be good? And I think, like Krista mentioned too, like that idea of sort of a change in approach and a change in how you think of things, and those are the coaches that are willing to change, that make a difference in people's lives, that are willing to adapt to something that they haven't come across before or didn't maybe deal with well last time, and now they're going to do it better with this next athlete or something like that. And I think the other one that came to mind was we talk about trust, and you have to build this trusting relationship with your athletes and so on. And I think a really important piece of that is you have to be trustworthy. Like, it's not about expecting trust or creating this, sort of idea of trust. It's being trustworthy, being there to depend on, being honest, even when it's difficult, or not maybe what you want to have happen or they want to hear as well sometimes. And to clarify that, because I feel like that's a little bit misleading, but my coach, one of my coaches, is the top Olympic coaches, and lean. After I'd stopped for fun, and there were international athletes in them, and coaches. We were playing around. I wanted to do this trick that I used to be able to do on Super Tramp, and I wasn't. She's like, "Oh, should I try a Rudy trick?" And he's like, "Oh, I think we really did." And I was like, "That wasn't a yes, Dave." He's like, "No, it wasn't." But it was like this honest answer, like, "Oh, wouldn't that be fun?" It's like, "Do you think I can land it?" Well, I think they'd be impressed if you did. It was like, he wasn't going to lie to me, but at the same time, he wasn't going to tell me no. But in that, he gave me enough information to know, okay, it wasn't going to be dangerous. I probably wasn't going to be successful. And I ended up doing the skill to my hands and feet. And it was like, I had the information I need. I knew exactly where I stood with this skill, because he was honest with me, right? So, yeah.
And the stories, look at that story, I'll tuck that one away and probably pull it out a little bit later, because it's a good illustration, right? So telling more stories is so powerful. And Tom?
Yeah, I think in terms of, the leadership or lack thereof, or at least the willingness to change conversation, is a lot of it comes down to what are the incentives. So if we're looking at a national level, right, the incentive is still performance based, right? Or that's the bulk of it. There are other pieces to it, and I think the formula is shifting. But if you look at, the business world and even in the oil and gas sector, your ESG ratings matter, your environmental, social, and corporate governance. That is what people are being judged on. You have CEOs now talking about their bonuses being tied to that, and a company's performance not purely being judged on returns to shareholders, but also what they do in the ESG space or just broader stakeholders. And it's the struggle is the story you tell around sport and the value of sport. It's really hard to tell a story other than we won a bunch of medals and that's an inspiration. Like, I do believe it's a much more subtle story to say, well, we helped, this athlete that you might not have heard of finished whatever at the Olympics, which is still incredible, or didn't make the team is even the better story. It's, by a fraction of a second, some bad luck, blah, 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 blah. Here's everything they've done with their life. That story is a heck of a lot harder to tell than, here's the Olympic medalist and look at how great that is. And so I think there's real challenges there around, again, what value are we providing and what stories are we telling to taxpayers that fund most of sport? And ironically, I do think a lot of the corporations behind sport and behind individual athletes at the Olympic, Paralympic level actually they get it. Like, they're less invested in the return on medals than most people would believe. I find, in my experience, with all the partners that I've dealt with on a close basis, that is not their big thing. And it's really interesting to see that divide. So anyone has a solution to that? Matt, maybe you might have one.
No, which is interesting because it's exactly what you're telling. Those are the stories they tell of amazing people that have overcome and achieved, and those do inspire people. It might not be as mainstream sexy, quote unquote, as the bronze, silver, or gold, but those are the kind of stories that need to be told. But in terms of leadership, we need lots of people with courage. First of all, the courage to say, we can do better, and the courage to say, we are going to focus on all of these stories because we know that in 4 or 5 years downstream, we're going to be able to tell these stories. And by the way, we put more people on the podium, got more people interested in said sport, etc. So that takes a lot of courage to walk into a situation and go, this isn't working, and recognize it's not working. And we've all talked about it. If participation numbers are down, then at the same time as the industries are ballooning into billion-dollar industries and less people are enjoying, there's something wrong. So it takes the courage to actually admit there's a problem. And then the second step is I think we need to expect some experience with sport leaders. That's as nicely as I can say it. Sport is a business. At any point where there's a transaction for money, for service, you have business. And to put leadership in because they are Adrian's buddy and Adrian's got a great position, so hey, why don't you take that position? Or because I was a great athlete, therefore that's going to translate into being a great manager of people or a great leader of a business. That's not true. And we've proven that. That's the good thing. We've proven that over and over and over again. So hopefully, courageous leadership and then experienced leadership. Are we creating people with people management skills, with business management skills, with that are good at creating ethical decisions? Are we supporting them with the frameworks that they need to do? And lastly, are we holding them accountable, as Thomas said, to whatever their vision, mission, and prescribed outcomes are and were? And by we, that is, parents, that is athletes, that is participants, that is other sport organizations, that is some organizational oversight that doesn't exist. And I'm not sure why it doesn't exist. But, the question that you asked, Jen, is what's it going to take? It's going to take a lot of those things to really get us to where we want to be, to level up, and to actually have us doing what we prescribe to every athlete that we train on every team. We talk to athletes about teamwork, responsibilities, roles, know your role, stay in your lane, trust the system. But we do not do that at almost any level of sport oversight or administration. And so that's a great opportunity. It's a tiny gap. It's a massive gap, but it's a great opportunity.
And I'm finding athletes are becoming equipped with this knowledge, which is a huge, that's a huge population of people that can be enacting change from within. Great to see. Adrian and I are part of a program actually called LEAD. And I was really impressed when we began the program, a number of senior leaders across Canada in sport coming with humility and saying to me, well, the reason I'm in this program is because I've been thrust into a position of leadership, but I don't have the leadership skills. That's the first time I've ever heard that. I've consulted lots of different organizations, different sectors. Very rarely does someone in a position of leadership have the humility to admit that they lack skills and are hungry for them. So it's been wonderful to see that in sport. I think we're on our way, but we'll see. And Adrian has some comments to make.
Yeah, again, I agree with everything that's been said. And I think that leadership is huge. And when we step outside and look at some of the leadership that's happening now, concepts like creating a deliberately developmental organization. So, for example, when Krista was talking about some of those coaches who are making changes, too often in sport, we'll read about a case study in a newspaper and there's a lot of finger pointing, like it was that person who was a bad person. But that person's not a bad person. That person did the best they could in that system and they might not have the skills. So, how do we create environments where coaches are allowed to fail and get better, just again, as we're doing with our athletes, where administrators can admit, I don't have that skill set. And when we provide them the opportunities to get better, it's just too, there are too many consequences to making mistakes right now. I've been at multi-sport games. I've been in London with a coach who was, a high performance director was telling that coach that if you don't win a medal, we're not renewing your contract at the end of this week. And it's a definite situation that's not unique. It happens in other situations as well, and that's not a deliberately developmental organization. And in corporate sectors, when you look at a coach at that level, there's been so much invested in that coach getting there, and coaches are seen as the first cut, and then they don't even give back to the system, and that's just a very sad situation because they have so much unique asset to bring. And perhaps this morning I was listening to a podcast where Brene Brown was interviewing Simon Sinek. It's her latest on her Dare to Lead series. And it was about the difference between a finite and infinite game mindset. And it was so powerful. And I couldn't help but think of the conversation we were having later today. And again, sport for me it's an infinite game. It's a tool to help us grow and become. And there's no end game, and it's just so different when we start to look at it through that lens. They talk about, it's not, Simon at one point said that I don't like the idea of strengths and weaknesses. I like the idea of learning about the characters and parts of a person and how it does and does not work in certain situations. And so again, it was just a really different lens or way of thinking of it. And so as we think about changing sport, I think we have to maybe change that culture, that mindset, or that way of being, so that everyone's set up to be successful, because that's why everyone's here. Everyone's here for greatness. Everyone's here to make those things happen. And we don't always have the systems in place. It's too absolute. It's too black or white. It's too you're gone if this doesn't happen. But you know what? It didn't happen right now, but we have some great systems in place, and it's going to happen later. And we can't see beyond that.
It's simplistic, as Tom was mentioning, it's a lazy outcome or a lazy criteria to only use medals as a measure. And actually they're a terrible measure because they are an outcome. How can we be more evolved, more mature? And there's this great quote, we move from naive simplicity to profound simplicity. So how can we be more profound in our measurement of the value of sport? And then, as Matt was saying, hold people to that account, to those criteria, as well as outcomes for sure. That's always a measure. But if it's only about money or it's only about medals, then we run into the risk of all costs, right? We'll go after those things and sacrifice everything else. And that's very dangerous. How do we keep a more expansive
I think that's really important because assessment's so important. When I taught at Kansas State University, Jerry Hanna was a senior faculty member, and it was the time of No Child Left Behind legislation in the United States of America. And Jerry Hanna, who had been an academic and worked in the education system for years, almost was like a broken man about this policy, because he recognized all these incredibly important things that would be dropped off the table because they weren't being measured through that legislation. And so I agree with what you're saying, Jen. I think this is the same kind of concept.
John Wooden, basketball coach, right? You know, historical and heroic. But there's this great quote from him. How do you know you were a good coach? And he says, I don't know. I won't know for 20 years. I won't know until those kids are adults and they're out in the community giving back and doing these things, right? So tracking that, telling those stories as well, being more creative in telling the story, as Thomas was saying, you know, instead of lazy around, yeah, they won a gold medal and it tells its own story. No, it doesn't. Even the gold medal stories aren't told in a very complex way or interesting way, I don't think. All right. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure if we have any other questions. I think we've actually touched on a lot of what people were asking about. The main thread I was hearing from people prior to the webinar was, you know, what are some practical skills? Where can you point me for training? How do I advocate for this kind of mentality in my realm? And we've talked a lot about these kind of concepts. And keeping our eyes on actually a broader view of human and social development when money is such a driver and pressure. We're touching on that. Are we asking too much of our coaches? Is it all up to them?
I'm off mute. I think we are asking a ton of our coaches now at least a high performance level, an absolute ton compared to those who've been around a long time and what they got involved with when they started their careers. They're in a completely different world and I think under-equipped to deal with it in some cases. Some of them are wonderful. Again, 99% are wonderful, but I do think we're asking a ton. But the reality is we're asking them a ton all at equal weight. So we want you to be the perfect leader and educator, but we also want you to win these medals and your contract's tied to X. So you have to shift the incentives and they'll do it. And if you shift it, you know, at the end of the day, people have to pay their bills. So I don't actually, you know, place a lot of blame for, depending on the level of behavior or misbehavior, obviously, but, and recognizing again that it's a minority that do that. But I do think we're asking a ton of coaches. It is a real concern. I think one thing though, that at a younger level, at any level, frankly, with coaches, that it's like my go-to when I talk to coaches or groups of coaches about supporting their athletes in a game plan way, if you don't have access to a program or an advisor or someone that can help you think through the balance, is just to use like a wellness wheel. It's one of the most ridiculous things, but it's incredibly powerful. Just like Google wellness wheel and implement that into your day-to-day thing with athletes. And it opens up the door for all sorts of conversations around how are they doing in their life. And you don't need to be, you know, a rocket scientist to help them with that. It is honestly, can be very profound and a good step for, particularly at a younger level with a coach that might not have access to some of the PD that a high performance coach would have.
I think one of the biggest fears is if we let go of medals, you know, and we'll never win again. And Kathy Bishop talks about, she just wrote this great book, The Long Win, but she talks about, you know, when did being top of the medal table matter? Like, when did that become such a thing? Or, you know, getting that first gold medal on Canadian soil. Why? So do we have to let go of medals? What's so bad about that? Those are contrasting questions. What do you think, Matt?
Well, and I also think that, yeah, we're asking a lot of our coaches because we're stepping up less and less in our education system and at home. So where the parent responsibilities, we're leaving it to this, and then for the teaching responsibilities, they've been marginalized in terms of the coaching and leadership. So I think that has exacerbated the expectation of coaches when we get there. Like, here, you tell my kid how to be a great kid. Well, actually, I'm just supposed to show your kid how to fall in love with the sport, you know. So help me out here. So I think it's not and it's been said already today, I think it's a shared responsibility. And that's what makes this tough, is because it's not one person, it's not one group, it's not one finger pointing, but that's the easiest thing to do. And that's what makes it tough.
Are we asking too much of athletes?
Yeah, I'll pass it to Heather in a second. I think we are asking some of the wrong things about athletes. I think in a way, yes, when it's you need to have this myopic focus on sport. And we are asking too much of athletes in that respect in this day and age, in some sports, in some cases, where people just don't know that it's better to have a broader approach to life and sport. Yeah, I think there is a lot there, and people need to reflect on it. Again, it gets back to the value. 30 years as a national team athlete, even if you do win a couple Olympic medals, in most sports, you're going to be worse off financially and career-wise than your peers, unless you take some concrete steps along the way. And it's just something we need to think about. That's younger people are thinking about that all the time, and it's crucially important. So I think sometimes we take it for granted that the athletes are living this, pseudo celebrity life, and that it's all great and wonderful, but there's a lot being asked of them. So yeah.
Heather.
Jen, I just wanted to go back and answer your question about do medals matter, I guess, was to paraphrase your question. And I think as much as the ideals of sport are there, and the benefits of sport are there regardless of medals, and that's not the point. I think medals do have a place, and it's just I guess trying to reach them without sacrificing the other benefits of sport. Like, I'm sorry, I can't remember who was talking earlier about that being an easy story to tell about, hey, we helped this guy out and he won a medal at the Olympics. Those are easy stories to tell. That's true. And they're also easy ways to get people involved. Like Jen, you talked about being rower in the 90s. There's no question that one of the reasons that I got involved in rowing was because I saw the success going on in 92 and 96. That sport then was in my mind as a sport to do. And without seeing all those medals, I'm not sure that I would have even considered rowing as a sport to do. And it's something that I've gotten a lot out of. So I think there is value to medals. And in some ways, the only value is just selling the sport so that people will get the other benefits that aren't medals. But yeah, that's my thoughts.
Thanks, Mark.
And I need to jump in here because I want to say that I agree. I think medals are valuable. And I think that if we want medals, then we have a responsibility to execute the things that we've been talking about on this call. I think that if you have good leadership, you're going to get more medals. If you value the human as a whole being, you're going to get more medals. If you help, so I think that I agree with you. I think that they are valuable. It's because of that it will give us energy to do this hard work, to do it in this way.
Yeah, because we're not saying that, right? We're not saying it's either or.
And I was just going to say, like, even just the concept of asking a lot of athletes, and it's like, well, why are we asking? Why aren't we giving? Like, the athlete is the reason. Like, the athlete is the middle of it all. The hopefully the one that has the big dreams and the big goals and the striving. If we're talking about high performance sport or at any level of sport, they have a goal they want to reach or something they want to achieve. Generally, in a lot of areas of sport, even if it's cooperative. And so rather than asking of them, it's looking at what can we do to help, what can we do to make more possibilities a reality for them, and how can we be part of that journey. And I think I always felt like as an athlete that it was a big responsibility. Like, being an athlete, I had a lot of people that were on my journey because I was on that journey. They wouldn't be on that journey without me kind of executing it, right? And so all of the help I had and all the tools I was given, my honoring that by doing the best I could or trying to put it together in the best way possible. I didn't ever feel like they were asking that of me, though. And so I think if we feel like we're asking or demanding of athletes medals or outcomes, then I think we're making a mistake.
You've done a lovely job throughout, Heather, of flipping things. And I agree. It's a partnership, hey? You really have a team around you, and the word competition, striving together, beautiful, not just with your opponent, but also with those who are helping you. And Matt and Krista, I'd like to give you an opportunity to weigh in, and then we'll finish off. Any other final words? Krista, Matt?
No, nothing that would be repeating. Totally agree. Leadership is my big one. I think everyone's got that. It's an opportunity. I think it's a great opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the question of whether we're asking too much of coaches is the same comment about athletes, balancing that challenge with that support. So we need to support coaches to gain the skills to coach ethically, to develop whole people. It's not just athletes who need support, the coaches need support too.
Beautiful, beautiful model. And so we'll finish off with that, in that sport really does represent such an opportunity for all of us to learn. It does model so many concepts. We had some great comments in the chat and some great interaction. Thanks, Mark Laidlaw, for weighing in. We go way back. Great to see so many people coming and joining us in this conversation. And please follow up with questions, because I'll be in touch with this gang. And we do want to keep the conversation rolling. I want to thank the Royal Roads team, Amara, Karen, and Andrea, for their support. And great to see so many Royal Roads partners show up for the webinar and participate. And we will be in touch. So this will all be recorded, posted on our website, of course, and associated resources